About a year and a half ago now, I did a video where I attempted to use Windows Longhorn on a real computer and attempted to install actual drivers and software on it, which predictably went badly. Well, I've decided it's time for another week of pain and torture because today I'm going to try and do the exact same thing again. But not with Windows Longhorn this time. Rather, another beta build of a different version of Windows that was also extremely hated upon its release. Windows 8 had a fascinating development for different reasons than Windows Vista. The two were both massive changes from their predecessors, and as I already said, both were incredibly unpopular at the release. Just like with previous Windows versions, before Windows 8 was released for real, it had several beta versions that were released to the public. The developer preview, which was released in September of 2011, the consumer preview, which was released in February of 2012, and the release preview, which was released in May of 2012. And of course, Windows 8's development period wasn't too bad compared to Windows Longhorn, so these pre-release beta versions actually aren't too bad compared to any build of Longhorn ever. So that got me thinking, what happens if you were to try and use one of these betas nowadays? The answer, probably nothing exciting, but I did it anyway. Today, I am going to install a Windows 8 beta on a computer and install a bunch of random software on it to see what happens. Specifically, I'll be installing the first of those betas, the developer preview, since I don't think there will be much functional difference between the three, but the developer preview visually is the most different. Maybe I'll try the other beta versions at a later time, but we'll see. Unlike Longhorn, I have a lot more confidence in this one that it will be at least somewhat successful. As always, we'll need a computer to do that on, and this time I've gone with that Lenovo ThinkCentre M91P that I used in a previous Windows 10 video, I think. This computer has an Intel Core i7-2600 CPU, with integrated HD graphics. It also has 8GB of RAM and a 1TB hard drive. And it's pretty much an era-appropriate machine for this build, as the computer was manufactured in late 2011. Currently, this computer is running a pretty vanilla install of Windows 10. So I think it's time to change that. I'm just kidding, we're not going to install it that way. We're going to clean install this. Although, I already had an issue before I even got started, as my USB drive wasn't showing up as a bootable device in the BIOS. Apparently, it was excluded from the boot order. I don't even know how that happened. Okay, take two. It's time to install Windows Developer Preview. One day, I hope to do a big Windows 8 beta build video, just like what I did with Windows Longhorn. But in the meantime, this build is more similar to Windows 7 than you might expect, as its install process is pretty similar to Windows 7's, even if it's got a different boot screen. I noticed this was incredibly fast. Even being installed onto a mechanical hard drive, this entire thing took less than 10 minutes before we were at the out-of-box experience. This was back during a time where you could actually change settings on your computer and have control over how much data your computer was sending home. What a concept. Anyway, that's the setup process. It's not very often I install Windows 8 beta builds, so I haven't seen some of this stuff in a really long time. But before we do anything else, it's always good to get some drivers installed. Though, because this computer was from the right time, there aren't that many to install. But I let it install the latest drivers anyway to see what would happen. Or at least the latest drivers that SDI had. On the surface, not much happened, since there was only one driver that had an error afterwards, and it was the management engine driver, so I'm sure at least some people would say that's probably a good thing. What wasn't a good thing was that the computer didn't boot back up afterwards, due to a driver issue. Based on the driver itself, it's likely SDI installed a SATA/RAID controller driver that the computer just didn't like. So I guess it's time to see how good this build's recovery environment is. That was another thing that was massively different in Windows 8. Some time had gone by before it prompted to use System Restore. This thing sure loves its fade animations. As if I'm any better. But anyway, System Restore did the trick, and the computer was working again. Just needed to install all those drivers again with that particular one deselected. And there we have it. So far, this OS seemed incredibly fast on this computer, even with a mechanical hard drive in it. This computer boots fairly quickly, and it feels really snappy to use. I expect this will change with software installed, but man, what a difference 15 years makes, huh? This time I knew I was probably going to need an internet connection to do much of anything, since I didn't have any local software prepared this time. So, why not try updating it? Not that I expected much to happen. The built-in Windows Update obviously couldn't establish a connection with anything, and Legacy Update seemed to know it was a beta build. It attempted to install updates for Windows Server 2012, which of course didn't work, and even though it did detect it as Windows Developer Preview, it unsurprisingly threw an error that I didn't care to figure out. With an active internet connection, I was kind of curious to see if any of the built-in apps on the start screen would do anything. If you're familiar with this build, you would know that apps pre-installed are just for demo purposes and don't actually function that much. The Windows Store wasn't even implemented in this build. Some of these would have needed an account. Windows 8 was the first version of Windows that contained Microsoft accounts, or in this build it's still called Windows Live IDs. Either way, that's not something I have here. I'm sure it's unsurprising to learn that not a single app I tried actually, worked. If there ever were functional servers, they were probably turned off or updated a long time ago. Well, if we want to use this setup, I suppose an important step would be a web browser. Unsurprisingly, the included version of Internet Explorer 10 is pretty much useless on both Bing and Google. I didn't want to connect this to my actual network drive at all, and all I had left was an ancient version of Firefox on my USB drive that was normally intended for Windows XP systems before I knew Supermium existed. But I didn't see why it wouldn't work here. Alright, point taken. Well, that didn't work, but somehow this old version of Supermium did, which is better anyway. I thought surely this would have been the other way around. Geez, I forgot how terrible the settings app in Windows 8 was. Anyway, with a functioning web browser, I was able to acquire two things. First, the latest version of Supermium, and second, a collection of Visual C runtime packages in the hopes of increasing software compatibility. These are pretty standard across Windows versions, so I thought if any updates would install, it would be these. During this time, I figured I'd customize the PC a little, although this beta version only contains one other desktop wallpaper, so I guess we're going with this one. Most of the runtime packages seem to install, with the exception of the newest ones, which I suppose isn't a surprise. Restarting the computer after this seemed to bring up a configuring Windows features prompt, which was wildly interesting. Now, to be honest, I didn't actually have anything prepared for this PC. The only plan was to just install random stuff. So, since we have a working web browser, alright, Supermium 122 it is. I decided to go to a website called Ninit. Ninite? I don't know how it's pronounced. This is a site I've used in the past that basically lets you install commonly used programs all through one installer. It seems pretty legit, and I personally think it's handy, and it has lots of options. So, I decided to select basically everything to install on this OS, with some exceptions since there were some things I already knew wouldn't be compatible. I have done this before. It's pretty stupid, especially if it's on a slow computer. But this one has a pretty good hard drive, so in theory it should be able to handle it. The installer got blocked by Windows Smart Screen, which gave me a good laugh. But anyway, it was time to unleash hell on this computer. This process was not going to be quick, and it already had issues with the very first thing it was installing, NVDA, which seemed to hang during its setup. I was able to end its setup executable in Task Manager, and it seemed to move past it afterwards. I had to walk away from the computer, but it seemed after that one hiccup, everything was going smoothly enough until it got to WinMerge, where it seemed to hang once again, but this time it was not able to recover itself, and there was no setup executable in Task Manager to end. And when I came back to the computer, it was at startup repair again? What the fuck? Okay, at this point, I was so confused. And unfortunately, I stopped the recording, so I didn't have anything to potentially figure out what happened. But sure enough, it did not boot anymore, and it could not seem to figure itself out. At least, System Restore was there, once again, to bail me out. It seemed to have some other restore points that were automatically created, which still didn't really tell me much of anything. And unfortunately, the latest restore point restored the computer back to how it was set up before the installer was ran. So it had to be ran all over again. This time I left the recording going for the whole time just so I could at least record everything, just with a few things taken off the setup this time. It took a lot of encouragement since there were several other things that seemed to just hang during setup. But more than an hour later, it completed everything it could. And I thought surely this would be the end of this and everything would be fine and I could move on. So imagine my surprise then when I came back a few hours later to find it was on the fucking startup repair screen again. It was failing the exact same way too. It would attempt to boot only to crash with an inaccessible boot device error, which was just so confusing. I had two theories as to what was going on here. The first was that it was somehow one of those programs that was just screwing everything up. The second was that it was due to this build expiring. This build, like with many other Windows builds, was compiled with a time bomb that was originally set to expire in early 2012. However, this build received several updates, including one that extended the time bomb until 2013. Either way, that was a long time ago, and I did not change the computer's date at all before I installed this, so it's still set to 2026, because I wanted to see what would happen, basically. Could that somehow be causing an issue here? Both of these theories somehow made no sense to me, and yet seemed plausible enough. I had to admit, I spent an embarrassing amount of time trying to figure this out. To make a long story shorter, I reverted the computer back to an old restore point once again and ran the Nina installer once again, which took another hour to complete, and then I rebooted the computer immediately after it was done. I should have just done this the first time, but I guess I didn't think this would be a problem. Sure enough though, it did not boot, confirming it was a program issue the whole time. But that doesn't entirely explain why I came back to the computer to find it rebooted for me. What on earth was that about? Well, remember the time bomb from a minute ago? In this build, when the time bomb expires, you can still use the OS, but it will reboot itself after a while. Because it was already broken from one of those programs, when it rebooted because of the time bomb, it instead couldn't boot back up and landed on startup repair. Basically, a program, and I don't know which one, so I never figured it out, caused the damage, and the time bomb finished it off. I still had a restore point with some of that stuff installed, and after 3 days of trying to get this to work, I decided it was good enough. Hilariously, Firefox, after being updated to a way newer version, opens just fine now. Most of this stuff opens fine, with some exceptions due to the lack of the newest Visual C runtime packages, and also due to a lack of any .NET framework being installed. Windows 8 no longer contained any components for .NET 2.0 or 3.5, instead requiring you to connect to Windows Update, something I can't do here. Even having the local files and an active internet connection, the install will still fail because it can't connect to Windows Update, which to me seems incredibly dumb. Since Firefox seems to work now, I thought I'd use that. Since it's newer, I just want to get my content blocker installed. My god, this thing really wants me to use Supermium 122. Anyway, I installed a bunch of new software. What about a bunch of old software? For that, it was time to go to another site that seems legit and is handy, oldversion.com, which has a bunch of old software on it. Of course, I can't download everything this site has. That would be ridiculous. So instead, I just kind of randomly picked through some old stuff to install on this machine that I did know, basically adding to the pile of garbage that was already there. During this time, I noticed Firefox was still using resources despite it not even being open at all. So it's clearly just must be really bugged on this OS. Also of significance, at some point, Windows Defender detected the adware OpenCandy in one of the downloaded files. So despite it being horribly out of date, it seems that Windows Defender is still at least somewhat functional. With the computer now thoroughly crapped up and looking like it has viruses installed, I think I've about had my fun with this setup. The computer seemed to handle all this software pretty well. Earlier in the video I mentioned how it was really fast, and though there is definitely noticeable slowdown, it still feels pretty snappy even with all this stuff on it. This computer has 8 gigabytes of RAM, but honestly, it could easily get away with 4 gigs or maybe even less, as this setup was barely using more than 2 gigs of RAM, even with lots of things opened. So, could you actually use Windows Developer Preview? Well, yeah, you could, with some conditions to consider. The most obvious one, of course, is that it's a beta build. Now, as far as beta builds go, this is actually a pretty good, stable one, in my opinion, but it still has a time bomb, which means if it isn't patched out, the computer will reboot after a few hours. It also means this OS has no actual updates at all, other than the few it received as late as early 2012. Another thing is that due to this build's kernel number being 6.2, in theory, its software compatibility level is Windows 8.0, which was abandoned much quicker than even Windows 8.1 was. And there are definitely things that will run on Windows 8.1 but will not run on Windows 8.0. I wasn't expecting it, but that happened here. And of course, there are things that still won't run anyway due to missing dependencies, particularly the newer Visual C runtimes and .NET Framework, which despite all my attempts was never something I could get working on this. And occasionally, there are things that will just inexplicably break the computer. TLDR, or is it too long didn't care in this case, it is a usable OS. It just depends on the programs you want to install. Not that I would recommend it. Hardware, of course, also matters too. Now, this ThinkCentre turned out to be a pretty good fit for this build, but that's not always going to be the case. So, I think that's about it for this one. I thought about trying stuff from my Steam library on this just to see what would launch, but to be honest, I think I'd rather not connect my actual Steam account to this out-of-date operating system with a bunch of unvetted software from the internet, but maybe that'll be a future video. To reiterate, it is definitely an experiment that is possible, as long as you have the right software. I still think this was a lot more successful than when I tried to do this kind of thing with that Windows Longhorn build. But that's an incredibly low bar. This build isn't particularly crash prone from my experience, but just like with Windows Longhorn, there's a fear, shall we say, that this OS can be bricked at any moment just from installing certain software. Although that is a lot less likely than it is on Windows Longhorn, it still happened here, and this was only really saved by the presence of System Restore. Without that, there would have been several times where this would have been completely bricked and not recoverable.